Well, hello YouTube, and Happy New Year from some douchebag in a muscle shirt. I've got day after New Year's Eve hair going on, all effing messed up. You know what's left of my hair, But yeah, that's Happy New Year, people. Whatever. So trying to keep this up once a week, and also the other, I think it was maybe even 2 weeks ago, 12 days ago, something like that. Pete did a video talking about DNA, etc. This is not a response to the entire video. This is kind of a response or inspired by just a tiny little fragment at the end of the video. A comment by a guy named MGTOW Demon. He said that he remarked that the Nazis. I'm just going to use the word. If my channel gets nuked, who cares? It's not a big channel. But yeah, the red armband people, as they were characterizing it. Let's just drop the BS. We're talking about the Nazis. Were They didn't like the Slavs for some reason, and I thought about making a comment. But then I was like, if I try to do that, I'm gonna write like a little pamphlet, and it's gonna be like ridiculously big. Why don't I just do a video? Since maybe my channel's kind of going in the history direction a little bit. This will kind of be like a history of like a little thought on the history of racist thought in Europe. So yeah, so and I have no sources, so you just gotta trust my, if you can't trust a douchebag in a muscle shirt, who can you trust, right? But I just kind of got my notes here. What are we talking about? We're talking about the genetics, yada yada. Okay, so so he mentioned that it was based that the Nazi opinion on genetics was not based on real genetic science. It was just based on kind of, hatred, stereotypes, just kind of feels. That's true enough, very true. However, I would point out that nobody back in those days, back in the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, 40s, in Nazi era when they were coming into power, nobody really had a very good insight into genetics. The science just didn't exist much. Now that said, we've known vaguely what DNA is since like the 1860s, but it was pretty foggy. I don't think we really even knew for sure that it was a double helix thing until 1953, when I think there were theories that it might have been like a double helix based on the Swiss scientists who originally discovered DNA, but it was pretty foggy until the 50s, and then even in the 50s the genetic science was not very good until the 80s. It kind of started taking off. So they just based their stuff on what people looked like, and measuring skulls. They were big into measuring skulls. It was this means you're an Aryan, this means you're not. So what were the things that they used to justify their hatred and, let's be real, genocide against the Slavic peoples that they committed during World War II? So first of all, there's a tendency, not just among the Nazis, but among like lots of people, to judge and condemn other people based on their relative technology, and it's pretty much not fair because, if you live in a part of the world that's isolated from access to building on knowledge and that kind of thing, of course your technology is going to be less, but first of all, and I've actually seen interviews of like former SS guys or former Nazi guys. And this question is actually asked, like, why'd you hate the Russians so much? Well, and they would say things like, well, like in Germany, we have indoor plumbing, and in Russia they have like an outhouse, basically saying that like kind of like we don't think they're intelligent. Oh, excuse me, like they don't think that they didn't think that people in Eastern Europe were like intelligent enough to, other than maybe a few rich people, yada yada, like maintain like a civilized infrastructure. So unfairly judging people based on their technology was part of it. And a lot of people say, well, gee, aren't a lot of Russians and Slavic people, aren't they actually blonde and blue eyed, and isn't that like the hallmark of the master race? That's true, but it's also true that there are a lot of Eastern European peoples with kind of Asiatic features. There's even some of the blonde people, they kind of got eyes that are shaped a little different. So, and the Nazis being obsessed with the idea of like a pure race, yada yada. There was this idea, and to be fair, there's some truth to this idea. There's this idea that not they were not purely Aryan, that they did a lot of intermarrying with like Turkic, Mongolian, basically Asiatic peoples, and of course the Nazis being really racist. Anybody who's not a Nordic Aryan is kind of lesser, and then you go down the rabbit hole of the stereotypes that people had from about Mongolian people, going all the way back to when Europe got invaded by the Mongols. They were kind of, characterized as these, horribly barbaric people. And so there's kind of this idea that the Slavic peoples, especially, maybe not all the Slavic peoples, but especially the further east Slavic peoples, like the Russians, were kind of the inheritors of, in part, at least in part, genetically, this Mongolian kind of thing that came into Europe. So yeah, this idea that maybe they're kind of Aryans, but they're impure, degenerated Aryans, that kind of thing, and that kind of goes along with they had this notion of there were like three kinds of quote unquote white people, and the three types. This is based on a book. Hitler actually called this book his Bible, and it was a book written by an American called "The Passing of the Great Race," and it was about the supposedly tragedy that the beautiful pure Nordic is going to go extinct because they're intermixing too much with other people and yada yada. Anyway, and it was written, and this was written like over 100 years ago, like very early 1900s. So compared to today, very, like you said, man, very poor science, very not well understood things. But when it comes to like white people or quote unquote Aryans, I guess, or I don't know, they kind of divided up into three types. In the South, the Mediterranean type, and in addition to Italian stuff, I think that kind of included like Levant Arabs and some of the Maghrebi people, maybe Mediterraneans, and then in the far north, the Nordic, and then kind of in between, they had a concept of a race called the Alpines, and you would think that they would be like, okay, well, the according to their ideology, their beliefs, okay, the Nordic are the best, but the Alpines, you would think they would think that the Alpines were sort of okay, sort of the second closest related to the Aryans, but actually they had more sympathy for the Mediterraneans because, like, when you look at history, they kind of gave credit where credit was due, like, like the ancient Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks. These were peoples that they would have associated with the Mediterranean race, and for some reason they don't. For some reason they don't give the Jews credit for that, even though they were kind of around that area. But yeah, they kind of said the Mediterranean race is a good race. The Nordics are, of course, the best, the best, the brightest, the strongest, and then the Alpines were kind of like, they kind of stereotype them as, well, they're kind of slow and they're not as bad as the non-white people, but they're kind of barely white, and they're kind of just these basic, slow people who aren't too bright, yada yada. And that's like most white people that they were kind of talking about the Slavs and even kind of some types of Germans that had a character like facial and skin tone characters that weren't quite the Nordic standard, and probably even some Celtic people would fit into this kind of broad Alpine racial categorization. That said, they didn't think the Alpines were totally bad. Like they were inferior to the Nordics and they were inferior to the Mediterraneans. And they actually thought that a lot that and they actually commented in this book, when Nordics and Mediterraneans sometimes intermarry, even though ideally a Nordic should stick to it, sometimes that's not a bad mix. But then Alpines, well, when they intermix with these Alpines, it kind of drags down the racial purity. Still, they had like some kind of respect for the Alpines. Like they didn't think the Alpines weren't like how they thought of the Jews or other races and they were considered like better than Jews, better than non-white races generally, but they were kind of like the most degenerate of the white races, but still kind of redeemable, maybe to an extent worth keeping around. But then when you talk about the Slavs, the people in the East, in addition to being kind of the lowest of the whites, they're also stereotyped as being, and like I said, a grain of truth to this, mixing with Turks, mixing with Mongols, mixing with Jews. And that's the big one. They were thought of as being so, first of all, not true Nordics, and then mixed with, and then sure they're kind of white, but then they're so mixed with these other quote unquote inferior races that they got down to the point where they're seen as like almost not as bad as Jews, but almost as bad as Jews. So yeah, that was kind of their justification for when they went into Eastern Europe, especially the Soviet Union. They kind of just killed everybody. They didn't give a fuck. They're like, nah, these are subhumans. Just take them out. Very very evil stuff going on in WW2, and of course, it should be obvious I'm not endorsing that philosophy, a very bad philosophy, but I just figure I should put that out there as a disclaimer. This is like a history of what they thought, not what's real, not what's real in terms of genetics or anything. Just figure I should put the disclaimer out there. But along those same lines, what's interesting is they had this general hatred of Slavic people, but it was not evenly distributed. Because because they were allies with some Slavic peoples, so they kind of, and there's a lot, and that's another thing. There's a lot of contradiction in this of like some Nazis would say, "Oh, Slavs are the worst," and another guy might have a different opinion and that kind of thing. But they kind of picked and choose which Slavs they really hated and which ones they kind of said, okay, you're not as good as us, quote unquote, Nordic Aryans, but you're redeemable enough that we're not going to kill you and we can use you. Because the Croatians, not the country Croatia specifically, but they recruited a bunch of Croatians and they fought on their side, and they were generally well treated by most accounts and some of them were even elite troops and everything. They had a big Croatian unit, so they were kind of okay with Croatians, perhaps because of a history of being influenced by German culture and maybe even some mixing with German, Austrian type people. So they seemed to basically like the Croatians. They were generally not, when they took over Czechoslovakia, they weren't, compared to the evils that they did against the Soviet peoples, they were relatively soft. I mean, I'm sure they did some bad stuff there too, but they were relatively soft with them compared to the Soviets when they invaded Czechoslovakia, and then they split Czechoslovakia gave the Slovaks independence and said, here's the deal, you get to be independent so you're not kind of dominated by the Bohemians, by the Czechs. In exchange, you're going to help me take on, and this was Hitler's exact words, you're going to help me take on the Mongol hordes. And he was talking about the Soviet Union. So they're kind of okay with the Slovaks for whatever reason, even though it's a Slavic people. So there's a lot of just contradictory stuff, and even though Serbs, really Serbs and Croatians, in a strictly genetic sense, they're pretty close. They liked the Croatians, they hated the Serbs. So yeah, they committed all kinds of atrocities against Poles, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Serbians in the name of this ideology, while at the same time kind of strangely picking some peoples who aren't so genetically different and making them their allies. And yeah, so there's a lot of complex, contradictory stuff going on, but yeah, this is the purpose of this video, is just to shed a little light on why they felt that way, and how they justified it, and and like MGTOW Demon said, it doesn't like Pete and MGTOW Demon were saying, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially looking 90 years later, like what were they thinking? But those were some of the general thoughts and justifications. I'm already at 16 minutes and something, so I should probably wrap this up here, because people get tired of looking at my ugly face. I get it, some fucking douche with a goofy shirt. It's like pretending like he knows a lot about history. You're probably like, what the fuck, right? Anyway, so yeah, talked about like discriminating based on their mixing and tech, and how they had this kind of contradictory stuff going on with regards to liking some types of Slavs. Talk about the Nordic and the Alpines. What else do I got here? The book, double helix, yada yada. Oh yeah, there was a part of the comment said that they didn't like the Jews because they were jealous of their IQ. I don't think they really knew, like, okay, IQ was kind of a new thing. I think it was in approximately the 1920s when they first, maybe 19 teens, I don't know, but IQ was not a really totally well-established thing. I don't think I'm not sure if they would have had access to statistics with regard to IQ. But yeah, Jews, kind of just in general, the Jews tend to be smart people, it seems. But the Nazis, but a lot of Jews are like, teachers, accountants, bankers. The Nazis didn't have a lot of respect for those type of persons. The Nazis were very, and kind of, I don't want to say German culture and Nazi culture are the same, because German culture there's good things in German culture, but obviously it sprang up among the Germans. There's kind of a thing of like priorities is what I'm trying to get at here. They didn't have much respect for the accountant, the teacher, yada yada. They respected real nuts and bolts, what gets my house built, what puts food on my table, what gets my car to run. There's a story about this Jew who was going into a concentration camp, and the guy, the Nazi who's kind of keeping track of stuff, asked him, "What do you do for work?" And he's like, "I'm a teacher." He smacks him and says, "You will work. Like, you will do some real shit, not this like intellectual stuff, So yeah, I don't think they knew this. I don't think they knew the stats that we have now with regards to intelligence of this or that group. Even if they did, they'd have some justification for why that's not the right kind of intelligence or yada yada. But my thoughts on IQ and other stuff. I should probably save this for another day. Do I got anything? I think I'll leave it there because yeah, I don't want to get too long. But yeah, doing this thing on the holidays lately did kind of later in the day on Christmas and now on New Year's Day, whenever recovering from the drinking last night. So so yeah, this is some douchebag just rambling about some history stuff that I've been interested in since World War II. That's one of my things. But anyway, I better shut up. Thanks for watching. Anybody who watched this, thank you, especially if you made it to the end. And this is some douchebag. Check